Food security or food safety is really kind of a baseline measure for how well a society or a community is doing. If we take food as one of the absolute most basic needs for survival, we can extrapolate that and see all of the different harms that not having access to good, healthy, nutritious food on a consistent basis can have on a young adult, on an older adult, and on the community as a whole. Food security and food access is crime prevention, is housing justice, is a public health issue, and is a long-term threat to established community networks. New Orleans is a really interesting place to talk about food insecurity and talk about hunger because so much of our culture is based on hospitality and food and cooking and all these wonderful dishes that we're known for. But when we get right down to it, there's a lot of people who not only can't afford to go out to eat, but can't afford to cook in their own homes. We see a lot of that in the plight of working families who are trying. You know, there's this misconception often that if you're hungry and you're trying to feed your family, you can go down to the church on the corner and get some canned goods and be okay and safe for the night. For most people, that's not an option. In order to qualify to visit a traditional USDA supplied pantry down here in New Orleans, you have to be making less than $21,412 gross for a family of two. You cannot raise a child on that, especially with rising rents and rising inflation. So we see a lot of people who make $21,413 who are still hungry but can't access any help.
In Louisiana, you know, the minimum wage today it doesn't exceed, I don't believe, $8 an hour. I think it's less than that. It's an incredibly low wage to try to live on. And obviously that affects people's food security, that affects how you're, you know, feeding, raising your family, how you're paying your rent, how you're meeting all of the economic realities of your life. That's always going to be tougher for low wealth families. It's always going to be tougher in low wealth communities. Particularly communities of color, and particularly maybe again here in the South. My experience with food security is pretty specific to New Orleans and more specifically the lower Ninth Ward. We see every day, you know, that folks here are affected by, you know, the lack of healthy choices, by the lack of options, by the fact that cheap food is poorer food for you to be, you know, to be subsisting on. It's not what you want to be feeding your family every day.
If you're not eating fresh, healthy food, then your body is going to suffer. If you're eating the wrong types of food day in and day out, you're more likely to get heart disease, diabetes, you're more prone to a lot of different diseases. So that's the main thing. When you get those diseases, then already you're having to pay for other medical costs, and then it's just a cycle of food insecurity once again because you're having to make those choices of paying medical bills, getting to your doctor's appointments, and putting fresh, healthy food on the table. So there are many long-term detrimental effects to food insecurity. I had to make a lot of difficult decisions between what I was buying at the grocery store. You know, you see the good, healthy, you know, produce and you want to buy that, but especially when inflation and prices are going up, you can't necessarily afford the $10 a pound chicken or the fresh onions that are right there. You have to go for the cheaper, you know, you can't buy fresh potatoes, you go to the box section and get scalloped potatoes, etc. So while I have been food insecure, I'm lucky enough to have worked my way and made myself non-food insecure at this point.
In the lower Ninth Ward, we are cut off from the rest of the city by an industrial canal. If you want to access a grocery store that does have fresh fruits and vegetables, then you need to go into the next parish over. So then you're going outside of the city. I would say that it's difficult, and definitely like even people that come into the food pantry that I run, you know, they have jobs, they work full-time jobs, but just because of inflation rates right now, and again, you're working a full-time job, so maybe you don't necessarily have the time to access a grocery store that is across the canal, you need to go to a food pantry. And again, there are so many opportunities for people to open up grocery stores in the lower Ninth Ward, especially since the only stores that we do have that sell food are either gas stations or convenience stores that oftentimes, if they have any fresh food, you know, it's gonna be something like maybe some oranges or apples. You aren't gonna have the variety that you have in, you know, more of a generic grocery store.
When we look at the dietary habits of children raised in or near poverty, we can see that even in adult life, even potentially with more consistent access to food, they tend to prefer more processed food, more saturated fats, more salts, more sugars, because at a certain point that palate becomes comforting, right? It's what you know. And if you're a working mom making just a little bit too much to ask for help, but not enough to eat healthy, maybe you can get to Walmart once a month and buy, rice and beans and frozen meat and some of these other long-lasting staples. But finding access to fresh fruits and vegetables on a consistent weekly basis is going to be a big challenge for most families.
When I was a very young child, probably from the age of 2 to 12, my family was pretty insecure. I grew up with a single mom, and we were pretty food insecure, and we were mostly eating shelf-stable food, very little fresh food. We would try to grow things on our own, but again, my mother being a single mom and having to work and also take care of me didn't really leave a lot of time for that. Yeah, and it's just, from the perspective of my 5-6-year-old self, it is stressful. It brings an immense amount of stress, not just to parents, but also children. And so then children, also have this idea in their minds we can't afford to eat this specific thing, and I don't know what we're gonna have for dinner tonight, and mom's really stressed out, so that's making me stressed out. And obviously when people are food insecure, it affects their physical health, but also I think it has a really big toll on people's mental health as well. And even, obviously the parent or the head of the household, but even the children in that house, I think really suffer mentally when their family is food insecure, because it brings stress onto them as well. Yeah.
Every single one of us knows someone who is hungry, and we just don't see it because hunger is often hidden. Hunger is thought to be deeply shameful, and we need to rip that Band-Aid off. We need to recognize that we all know at least 3 people who are hungry tonight, whether it's the cashier at the checkout, the bartender down the street, or the nurse assistant at the doctor's office. One of them has been hungry in the last week. By bringing fresh, good food into New Orleans neighborhoods, Culture Aid is able to provide that sense of food safety, where families know where their next meal is coming from and are more likely to cook together and eat things that they enjoy.
Culture Aid NOLA is the only no-barrier food distribution in New Orleans. That is huge and significant for multiple reasons. The main one being that we are here every single week, and anyone, no matter their demographic, how much money they make, anything in their background, people can come and get free access to food. No barrier, the main difference is that we don't ask for any type of paperwork. It is just show up and get food, first come, first serve. So as long as we have items, we are giving them out. We don't require anyone to show any form of paperwork, ID, their tax stubs, anything like that. We are just here to serve.
In March 2020, as New Orleans tourism industry began shutting down, we were able to rescue food from closing restaurants, and on March 23, 2020, we cooked off about 500 meals and served them to the community. We were very proud of ourselves. 500 meals is not small potatoes, but it wasn't enough. So the next week we went out and we cooked 750 meals, and it still wasn't enough. The week after that, we served 5,000 meals to our community, and we finally began to see that we were making a difference. Since then, Culture Aid has served about 2 million pounds of food, an average of 3,000 people a week, which is about 2,000 families a month. We are dedicated to changing the narrative of scarcity. There is enough food. There is enough food for everyone, and there is no reason why we can't share it with each other.
I have been part of organizations that put service above self. So that is who I am at the core of my person. I didn't want it to go into a job where I'm sitting in an office all day, signing checks, writing papers, and just clocking in at 9 and clocking out at 5 p.m. I love this job, and I love the type of work that it is because I'm seeing the effect firsthand.
I was never a volunteer really for anything like this. I passed by a food bank line at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and thought I could do something. And once I saw the first time that I put something in the hands of someone who needed food. They were overwhelmed, I was overwhelmed, and I will never forget that feeling, and I want to duplicate that as much as I can.
So Lower9.org was founded just after Hurricane Katrina as a solution to what we saw were going to be long-term disaster recovery needs following Hurricane Katrina itself. And when I say Hurricane Katrina, let me be clear, I mean either the federal flood or the levee breaches of 2005. That's, you know, when 80% of the city of New Orleans flooded, and when areas like this were, you know, really adversely affected. The percentage of residential properties in the lower Ninth Ward that were rendered uninhabitable in 2005 was 100%. Every single home was destroyed. 2005, 6, 7, you know, you're doing things like putting out hot meals, you know, thousands of them a day to the community, gutting houses, doing things like that. Lower9.org sprung out as a long-term disaster recovery organization. We did not get into food security work again until COVID. And we actually shuttered the organization for 9 months, and everybody stopped taking a paycheck, and most folks, you know, did other things. I was sitting at home bored and started attending food security task force meetings with representatives from all over the city, and realized that there was a gap here in the lower Ninth Ward that needed to get filled. So started working with America's Second Harvest, who are an incredible organization that have been incredibly generous with us and do incredible work. We did distributions, just literally putting food in people's trunks. Open your trunk, drive through, here's some food, off you go. Very contact-free, very safe. You know, it was at the height of the pandemic. We started doing that work in March of 2020. In November of that year, we opened a brick-and-mortar food pantry. And we operate a brick-and-mortar food pantry today. Here, again pointing, just over here on the other side of the neighborhood. So to date, Lower9.org has fully built 91 homes, and we've done repair and renovation work on over 300 more residential properties. And last I checked, pounds of food per day was about 300. That's from the onset of COVID through to today. We only do a once weekly distribution, but we're putting out quite a lot of product on that one day a week. And it's been amazing. We serve 60, 70 families a week out of that pantry, and so that's, you know, several people per household. Those numbers really add up, and the pounds of food. And we also work really closely with Culture Aid. Culture Aid is a donor to us as well, and we get what we call barrier-free food from Culture Aid. We get barrier-free and USDA food from Second Harvest. So whether people qualify for USDA food, whether they can prove certain low level of, you know, income, or whether they cannot or don't choose to jump through those hoops, if you will, for want of a better word, we've got food for everybody who comes in the door. And that's really, really rewarding work.
One of the biggest challenges facing New Orleans today is gentrification. We've been in an accelerated phase of gentrification since well before Hurricane Katrina, but that definitely exacerbated it. We're looking at, you know, a huge overnight and catastrophic loss of many, many single-family dwellings and long-term occupied homes. At the same time, we're seeing an influx of slightly more well-to-do relief workers, for which we are still grateful. But over time, as we revert more to this tourist-based economy, which currently affects 70% of our tax base, we start to see locals getting priced out. Whether that's recent locals or multi-generational families, as Airbnbs come in, as rents rise, it becomes harder to live. Now, when we take that and we look at it and contrast it to hunger, what we see is that in areas with extreme gentrification, driven primarily by the tourist economy and by Airbnbs, illegal Airbnbs, there's less of a demand for locally based and locally useful services. If you're coming into town on a bachelorette party weekend and you're staying in what used to be someone's home in Tremé, you don't need a grocery store around the corner. But the lady that used to live there did.
So those types of realities come about because of institutionalized racism, you know, in America, and I'm sure in other places. But again, my experience is pretty localized. And I think that broad strokes answers to some of those big outlying questions will result in change that will affect things like food security, which is by no means a minor or an unimportant issue. I think that it will be interesting to see what happens with food security as movements are progressing that are about social justice. And I'm seeing a lot of that work, and that makes me very hopeful.
Folks ready for hurricane season. Tomorrow, Culture Aid NOLA, the local nonprofit already feeding hundreds of New Orleans families every week, well, they're producing their first hurricane supply giveaway before we've had our first hurricane. The goal is to get things like shelf-stable foods and cleaning supplies and canned water and tarps in the hands of residents before they need them in the wake of a storm.
At the very end of 2021, beginning of 2022, Erica Chomsky-Adelson and the rest of our operations team came together and were just brainstorming what we were going to do for hurricane season this year. We had an immediate and direct response after Hurricane Ida in 2021, which was a huge impact for the city, and we were able to help feed thousands of individuals every single day. So while starting to plan for our 2022 hurricane plan, we had the idea that we should do a large-scale distribution of hurricane supplies before a hurricane hits. The city of New Orleans, while we do have plans to evacuate, we don't always have the time to evacuate because tropical storms can turn into a Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane at the tip of a dime and be very scary. So families don't have the opportunity to evacuate, nor do a lot of the families have the means to evacuate. So the best way to pre-position hurricane supplies is in people's homes, not in warehouses. So when a hurricane or a storm actually hits, families have the immediate supplies in their homes ready to survive and do something for the next 72 hours, the first 72 hours of a hurricane. That's kind of the most important time to make sure you, your family, and all of your belongings are safe. So our July supply event, this is the first of its kind here in New Orleans and that I'm aware of anywhere in the United States for a mass scale natural disaster to pre-position and just plan for it in advance. Specifically with climate change, we are seeing an uptick in hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, etc. So this model should hopefully be replicated in other places as well, because this is an event that definitely needs to happen. We'll be serving 2,000 families hurricane supplies. Each family is going to receive approximately 70 pounds of hurricane supplies, including MRE, food boxes, packs of water, 5-gallon buckets, cleaning supplies. We even have coloring books and crayons for the kids because they're definitely going to be bored and antsy in those first 72 hours.
It's a tough issue. Food and housing, these are the things that loweredeye.org does and pays attention to and provides services surrounding. And I mean, before you have a roof over your head and a plate of food in front of you, you just can't do anything else. It just feels like so many people are subsisting at that very basic level of just human survival. I'd really like to see people get lifted up higher than that so that everybody can be successful in lots of other ways. And when you look at a city like New Orleans, it's fast approaching the highest, murder rate in the city, in the country, and years ago was the second highest on the continent. You have to recognize, I think common sense dictates that this has to do with people being financially insecure and being insecure about their food and housing.
New Orleans, as a city and as a community, for all of our features and all of our faults, is uniquely positioned to lead the way in community-based response, whether that's to a sudden natural disaster like a hurricane, or a slow-moving man-made disaster like a recession, or some as yet unforeseen cataclysmic event like COVID. We have the networks here, we have the deep generational love for each other here, and as a city known worldwide for our hospitality and for our food, we have the opportunity to lead the way and prove that this is possible.
Here's the thing about resilience, and this is the thing that people don't recognize. It's all well and good to say, those folks are resilient. Look at them. They've managed to lift themselves up by their bootstraps and, figure it out, in the face of adversity. I want to talk about that adversity. I want to talk about the systems that have been put in place to keep people down and why it is that we expect them to be resilient. They talked a lot about resiliency after Katrina. It took a few years for that to become a real buzzword. People don't need to be resilient. We need to address the injustices in our society that make it necessary for people to lift themselves back up out of poverty, out of food insecurity, away from situations that affect them day to day about housing insecurity and what have you. Disaster recovery from events that shouldn't have happened in the first place. No. I don't want people to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. I don't want, the expression oftentimes that you'll hear is people saying, we teach a man to fish, right? If you give a man a fish, he eats for one day. You teach a man to fish, he eats for 10. No. That's assuming he's got a boat. That's assuming he's got a pole and bait. That's assuming that the water is clean and that it's full of fish in the first place. That's assuming that he has the time to take off from work to go fishing. It's ludicrous. And it's not appropriate to talk about food security in the same sense that you would talk about almost anything else. These are basic human rights. So not giving people the basic tools or access to be successful on any level. When you're hungry, that's all you can do is think about how to fill that pit in your stomach. And I'm not speaking, let me be clear, I'm not speaking from personal experience unless I'm like dieting. I've never been hungry in my life. Really legitimately hungry. I think anybody who has will tell you that's all you got. That's all you can do. And anybody who will tell you, who has ever been without a roof over their head will tell you that's all you can do is just focus on that and get through that. So in terms of like stories about people solving their own problems, I don't think that they should have to do that. I don't think the problem should exist in the first place. And I certainly don't think anybody without privilege and access has the ability to solve those problems for themselves.